Captain Torvin watched with narrowed eyes as the human warship emerged from hyperspace, the sleek metal of its hull glinting in the artificial light of the nearby star. He hated this. He hated that the humans were even necessary. His people, the Vascari, had dominated the stars for centuries. Explorers, traders, and peacekeepers. They'd prided themselves on diplomacy and exploration, using ships designed for science, commerce, and peaceful missions. But humans? They had taken a different path, and it unnerved him. "Captain, the Resolute has arrived," his first officer, Kilak, announced. Torvin gave a curt nod, his gaze never leaving the human ship. The Resolute was a vessel unlike anything the Vascari had ever constructed. Its very design screamed aggression. Thick armor plating, heavy weapon turrets, and missile bays that could level an entire city from orbit. The humans had a singular focus when it came to spacefaring technology: war. And now, in the face of the Calic incursion, the Vascari needed that ruthless efficiency. "Bring them aboard," Torvin said finally, his voice tight with frustration. "Let's see what our allies have to offer." Kilak hesitated. "Captain, are you sure?" "Do it." The tension in the air was palpable as the human landing craft docked. Torvin's tail twitched in annoyance as he prepared to greet the humans. He could already imagine their smug expressions, their cold, calculating demeanor. The Vascari had known peace for generations, but now, thanks to these invaders from the Calic Empire, they had been forced to call upon the galaxy's only species willing to dedicate entire ships to war. The airlock hissed open, and a squad of human soldiers marched out. Their leader, Commander Eric Cole, was a towering figure in full combat gear. His face was hard, eyes sharp, taking in everything as if calculating the most efficient way to destroy the room, the ship, and possibly the planet below. "Captain Torvin," Cole said, his voice clipped and professional. "We're here to assist." Torvin's jaw clenched. "So I see." Commander Cole and his team settled into the briefing room aboard the Vascari Spirit. Torvin sat at the head of the table, surrounded by his senior officers, all of whom eyed the humans with thinly veiled distrust. The Vascari were a proud race, tall, lean, with iridescent skin that shimmered under the ship's soft lighting. They valued knowledge, diplomacy, and the pursuit of harmony. It was a stark contrast to the humans, whose very existence seemed to revolve around conflict. "We have detailed scans of the Calic fleet," Torvin began, gesturing to the holographic display in the center of the table. "They're heavily armored, with weapons that could devastate our defense lines." "Our ships are not built for this," Cole interrupted. "Your ships aren't designed for warfare. They're too lightly armored, too slow, and your weapons won't even scratch their hulls." Torvin bristled at the blunt assessment. "Our ships are designed for exploration, diplomacy, and peacekeeping. We don't engage in wars as a first resort." "Maybe that's why you're losing," Cole replied without missing a beat. The room fell silent. The Vascari officers exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared speak. Torvin's face flushed with anger, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had to admit, as much as he despised it, the humans were right. The Calic Empire had wiped out half their fleet in mere days. Without help, the Vascari stood no chance. "What do you suggest, Commander?" Torvin asked, barely keeping the disdain out of his voice. Cole leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Let us handle the combat. You focus on evacuating civilians and keeping your world secure. We'll take care of the Calic." "You mean to say we should hide while you wage war on our behalf?" One of Torvin's officers, General Tuvok, interjected. "If you want to survive, yes," Cole replied. "We're the only ones with ships capable of taking on the Calic. Our warships were built for this. Yours weren't." There was an uncomfortable pause, as Torvin mulled over the reality that had been plaguing him since the humans had been called in. His pride fought against the logic, but deep down, he knew the truth. The Vascari had never faced an enemy like the Calic. The galaxy had never needed a race of warriors, until now. "Very well," Torvin said at last. "But know this, Commander. We do not take lightly to this partnership. The Vascari are not cowards." Cole met his gaze without flinching. "I never said you were, Captain. But we'll win this fight, or die trying. That's what we do." Days passed as the human warship, the Resolute, prepared for battle. The Vascari watched in awe as the humans operated their vessel with a cold, efficient precision. The Resolute bristled with weaponry that the Vascari could barely comprehend. Massive cannons, missile batteries, and energy shields, technology designed with only one purpose in mind: destruction. Torkin stood on the bridge of his own ship, the Vascari Spirit, watching the human vessel move into position. He couldn't deny the anxiety that gnawed at him. This was their last hope. The Calic fleet had already entered the system, and the humans would be the ones standing between the Vascari and annihilation. "They're here," Kilak reported, his voice tight with fear. "The Calic fleet is coming." Torvin looked at the view screen, where the massive ships of the Calic Empire were bearing down on them. The Vascari ships had already begun retreating, moving into defensive formations around their home planet. But the Resolute held its ground, moving forward to meet the Calic head-on. "Are they insane?" Torvin muttered, watching as the human warship charged directly at the enemy fleet. "They'll be torn apart." But Commander Cole had different plans. The Resolute fired its main cannon, a massive energy beam that sliced through the void and struck the Lid Calic ship. The explosion lit up the darkness of space as the Calic ship disintegrated under the assault. The rest of the fleet scrambled, adjusting their formation, but it was too late. The Resolute had already moved into attack range. "They're fighting," Kilak whispered, awe in his voice. "They're actually fighting them." Torvin watched in stunned silence as the humans unleashed a barrage of firepower that the Vascari could never have dreamed of. The Calic fleet, caught off guard by the sheer ferocity of the attack, began to falter. One by one, their ships were torn apart by the relentless assault. And for the first time, Torvin understood why the humans had dedicated their ships to warfare. The battle raged on, and for the first time in his life, Captain Torvin witnessed the brutal reality of space warfare. The Calic fleet was no pushover. Despite the devastating losses inflicted by the Resolute, the Calic ships retaliated with brutal force. They unleashed energy blasts and missiles that slammed into the human warship's shields, causing them to flicker and dim under the sustained assault. Torvin could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he watched the Resolute take hit after hit. Despite the damage, the human vessel continued its relentless onslaught, retaliating with surgical precision. But even he could see the toll the battle was taking. "Shields down to 50%, Kilak reported, his voice tense. "They can't hold out much longer." Torvin gripped the edge of the console, his claws digging into the metal. The Vascari ships had long since pulled back, retreating behind their planetary defenses. They weren't built for this kind of fight. But the humans, they pressed forward, undeterred, determined to win at all costs. "How can they keep fighting?" Torvin muttered under his breath. "They were bred for this," Kilak said quietly. "We've spent generations avoiding war, but the humans, they've spent generations perfecting it." Torvin's gaze hardened as he watched the battle unfold. He had never fully understood the human obsession with warfare. The Vascari had always believed in peaceful solutions, in diplomacy and cooperation. But as the Calic ships exploded under the relentless assault of the Resolute, he began to see the other side of the coin. The galaxy wasn't always kind. Sometimes, peace had to be fought for. "They're not going to last," General Tuvik said, his voice grim. "If we don't do something, the humans will be destroyed. And we'll be next." Torvin knew he was right. The Calic were adapting, learning from their losses, and their firepower was focused entirely on the human ship. The Resolute was tough, but it wasn't invincible. And if they fell, the Vascari would have no chance of survival. "We have to help them," Torvin said, his voice firm. "Prepare the fleet. We're going in." Keelak looked at him in shock. "Captain, our ships aren't equipped for this kind of fight. We'll be torn apart." "I'm aware," Torvin replied, his eyes never leaving the view screen. "But if we do nothing, we're already dead. We either stand with them, or we fall alone." There was a long pause, then Keelak gave a reluctant nod. "Understood, Captain." The Vascari ships moved into position, forming a protective screen around the Resolute. They couldn't match the humans' firepower, but they could provide cover, drawing some of the colic fire away from the damaged warship. Torkin watched as his fleet opened fire, their lighter weapons peppering the colic ships. It wasn't much, but it was enough. With the pressure eased, the Resolute regrouped and launched a final devastating assault. Torvin held his breath as the human ship's main cannon fired one last time, the beam of energy slicing through the colic flagship. The explosion was massive, and for a moment, the entire battlefield went silent. The colic were defeated. The battle was over, but the cost had been high. The Resolute had taken heavy damage, and the Vascari fleet had lost several ships in the desperate bid to protect their human allies. The victory was theirs, but it was a bittersweet one. Torvin stood on the bridge of the Vascari Spirit, watching as the remaining colic ships retreated into hyperspace. His crew was exhausted, the weight of the battle hanging heavy in the air. But they were alive. Against all odds, they had survived. "Captain," Keelak said softly, approaching him. "The humans are hailing us." Torvin nodded, and the view screen flickered to life, revealing Commander Cole. The human's face was streaked with grime and blood, his uniform torn, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "We did it," Cole said simply. Torvin gave a curt nod. "We did. But at what cost?" Cole's expression remained unreadable. "War always has a cost, Captain, but sometimes it's the only way to ensure peace." Torvin's tail flicked in agitation, but he didn't argue. In the end, the humans had been right. The colic had been a threat unlike any the Vascari had ever faced, and diplomacy alone wouldn't have saved them. It had taken the brutal efficiency of the human warship to turn the tide. "What now?" Torvin asked, his voice heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. "Now," Cole replied, "we rebuild. We've shown the colic that we won't be easy prey. But they'll be back. And next time, they'll be prepared. So we need to be as well." Torvin's stomach churned at the thought. More war. More death. It wasn't the Vascari way. But as he looked at the battered remains of his fleet, he knew they didn't have a choice. "Your people are warriors, Commander," Torvin said quietly. "Ours are not." Cole's gaze softened, just for a moment. "Maybe not. But you fought today. You saved our lives. That makes you warriors in my book." Torvin didn't respond. He didn't feel like a warrior. He felt like a leader forced to make impossible choices, to send his people into a battle they weren't prepared for. But he couldn't deny the truth. Without the humans, they would all be dead. As the human warship prepared to depart, Torvin allowed himself a moment of reflection. The Vascari had always prided themselves on their peaceful ways, their ability to solve problems without resorting to violence. But in a galaxy filled with threats like the colic, perhaps there was something to be learned from the humans. Maybe, just maybe, there was a time for peace and a time for war.